Hi, World History. This is Mr. Janosiak. I hope you are all healthy. Today, and starting this week, we are going to look at kind of the going ons in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East. We will be focusing on that throughout the week, and then we will start the rise of fascism and World War II next week. So, our first lesson is chapter 21, pages 295 to 302, if you are doing that on your own. So, what were the causes and effects of political unrest in Latin America in the 19th and 20th centuries? Introduction. It was still dark that morning of September 16th, 1810, when Father Miguel Hidalgo rang the bells of his church in the rural village of Dolores to summon his Indian and mestizo, or mixed race parishioners. My children, he shouted to the crowd, will you free yourselves? This call to action launched Mexico's 11-year fight for freedom from Spanish rule. Father Hidalgo's famous cry, known as the Grito de Dolores, is still reenacted every year throughout Mexico on September 15th, the eve of Mexico's Independence Day. So it was on September 15th, 1910, when dignitaries from around the world gathered in Mexico City to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Mexico's independence and the 80th birthday of its longtime authoritarian leader, Porfirio Diaz. Diaz spared no expense on the lavish month-long event. Its cost was greater than his country's entire education budget. Diaz arranged for a costly exhibit of Spanish art in a new building specially constructed to display it. The building also housed a theater, and an elaborate, one-of-a-kind stained glass curtain was created for the occasion by the famous designer, Louis Tiffany. At one grand ball, Diaz provided 20 train carloads of imported French champagne. It was served by European waiters or by Mexicans who looked European. Diaz wished to portray Mexico as the land of Cortez, not the land of Montezuma. He had the city's poor, who were overwhelmingly Indian mestizo, rounded up to keep them out of sight. In his 30th year of rule, Diaz seemed to be at the height of his power. Few could have imagined that in just a few months he would be overthrown in what became one of the greatest political and social revolutions of the 20th century. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 would upset the political and social status quo throughout Latin America. Themes throughout this lesson. Latin American governments were unstable in this era as liberal and conservative elites, often backed by the military, struggled for control. Largely rural, resource-based, and export-based economies grew and changed in response to global economic conditions. Vast disparities between social classes created tensions and helped to trigger unrest and political change. The revolutions in Latin America in the early 1800s brought independence from Spanish and Portuguese control. But they changed very little else. The social structure of the new nations remained essentially intact. The new nations adopted constitutions based on US and European models. These new constitutions promised representative government and equality. However, Latin America did not have much of a democratic tradition. In practice, most nations became oligarchies ruled by upper-class citizens of European descent. The majority of people had little or no voice in the government. The decades that followed independence from Europe were marked by instability and unrest. Much of it involved disputes between caudillos. Caudillos were army generals or powerful civilian leaders backed by armed groups of followers. Not all caudillos came from the upper classes. Some had very humble backgrounds. However, they usually ruled with upper class support. In return, caudillos protected their supporters' wealth and property. A few caudillos actually brought order to their nations. For example, Juan Manuel de Rosas ruled Argentina as dictator from 1835 to 1852. He was supported by ranchers from his area and a force of gauchos, cowboys. His brutal tactics allowed him to maintain stability. He was able to defeat attempts by caudillos from other regions to overthrow him. Most often, however, caudillos and dictators brought political instability. They usually did not have the support of most of the people. Some were elected with the support of only the upper classes. Others seized power through force. Mexico had 48 governments between 1825 and 1855. Chile had 30 between 1823 and 1830. In most Latin American countries, two competing groups struggled for power. These groups were usually known as liberals and conservatives. Both groups were made of elites of European descent. They shared the goals of protecting their property and keeping their own class in power. The conservative elite worked to preserve the old colonial culture. Conservatives generally opposed modernization and economic development. In general, the conservative elite consisted of large landowners. The liberal elite tended to be wealthy merchants and professionals. They claimed to support the Enlightenment ideal of rights and freedom for all people. However, they also believed that the common people were not ready to exercise most rights and freedoms wisely. Liberals therefore supported powerful governments. They thought this was the best way to modernize society and prepare people for freedom and equality. This approach often produced dictatorships. They sacrificed people's rights in the name of progress. Throughout the 1800s, liberals and conservatives competed for control of government in many countries. Argentina, Colombia, Uruguay, and Venezuela experienced long periods of unrest. In the 1880s, conservatives emerged victorious in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, and Paraguay. In Venezuela, unrest continued until a military dictator took over in 1908. Elsewhere in South America, the liberals gradually gained control. By World War I, they had replaced conservative governments in Argentina, Bolivia, and Paraguay. Latin American economies in the 1800s were based on the export of agricultural products and other raw materials. Americans and Europeans bought coffee and sugar from Brazil. Cattle and sheep from Argentina and Uruguay supplied meat to Great Britain. Rubber from Brazil, wool from Argentina, and copper and nitrates from mines in Chile and Peru provided raw materials for European industries. Many countries began developing their infrastructure in the mid-1800s to meet demand for their raw materials. Governments and business people built roads and railroads to bring goods to cities on the coast. They expanded and modernized harbors. Merchant ships switched from sail to steam. Foreign investors financed most improvements. Foreign banks often made loans to the Latin American government or business people to pay for such projects. In many cases, foreigners owned local railroads, mines, ranches, and plantations. At first, most investment was European and mainly British. However, by the early 1900s, the United States had replaced Britain as the biggest investor in Latin America. The growth of industry in the United States and Europe in the late 1800s and early 1900s brought rapid growth to Latin American economies. By World War I, the region was exporting 18% of the world's grain, 38% of its sugar, and 62% of its coffee, cocoa, and tea. Many Latin American elites became rich as a result. The masses, however, did not benefit as much. Other changes also took place as Latin American economies developed. In rural regions, Indians and other peasants were forced off their land as ranches and plantations grew. Some became hired hands. Others moved to cities to find jobs. Factories appeared to process agricultural products for export. In Mexico City, hundreds of new factories opened. Manufacturing also sprang up in countries like Chile and Brazil. As workers left the countryside for jobs in factories, urban populations grew quickly in some Latin American countries. Sao Paulo, Brazil increased from 35,000 people in 1883 to 350,000 people by 1907. Rio de Janeiro's population doubled to 1 million between 1890 and 1920. By the mid-1900s, about 40% of Latin Americans lived in urban areas. However, in less developed countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Peru, the population remained largely rural. As cities grew, an urban middle class emerged. Economic growth attracted large numbers of immigrants from Europe. Argentina and Brazil received the most European immigrants. Immigrant workers organized Latin America's first labor unions. This kind of social and economic change, and the example of a revolution in Mexico, would bring even greater unrest to South America in the 20th century.